The Arab awakening helped topple dictators in North Africa, but what happened when it went east? Well, the absolute monarchs of the Arabian Peninsula are still in place. And what about Syria, a strategic nation whose destiny will affect the whole region? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. Well, the Syrian regime has been facing an insurrection now since March. But recently the pressure on President Assad to go has increased dramatically from both Western nations and the Arab League. So, what's going on? And why is it that the Western countries that want Assad to go will not take the same steps as they did against Libya? Well, before we find out what the people think here on the streets of London, here's a quick video clip.
The United Nations says that more than 4,000 Syrians, including many in the security forces, have been killed in the turmoil that began in mid-March. Western countries, as well as the opposition, accuse Syrian security forces of being behind the deadly violence. They say the bulk of the killings are the result of a military crackdown on protesters. The Syrian government blames the unrest on what it describes as outlaws, saboteurs, and armed terrorist groups. It also claims that the insurrection is being orchestrated from abroad. Armed rebels who call themselves the Free Syrian Army have attacked army bases and government buildings. The Arab League has suspended Syria and imposed sanctions on the country. It has also frozen the assets of government officials and banned them from travelling to Arab states. The Persian Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Yemen, all ultimately rely on the United States for their national security, spending billions each year on armaments purchased from Western countries. When undemocratic regimes are challenged in the Arabian Peninsula, the West mostly remains silent about the need for democracy and merely advises the rulers to show restraint in quelling anti-regime protests. In contrast, Syria is part of an alliance that includes Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Palestinian movement Hamas that rejects the right of the United States and Israel to enjoy military hegemony over the Middle East. The Syrian opposition looks to the Persian Gulf states for its support and backing, and by doing so is allying itself with Western interests. The leader of the main opposition group, Burhan Khalioun, said that after the fall of President Assad, Syria would cut its close ties with Iran and Hezbollah. He said that Syria's future is truly tied to the Arab world and the Gulf in particular. He dismissed the Syrian government's friendship with Iran and resistance movements in the region as abnormal. So, in adopting this stance on Syria, are the West and the Persian Gulf states thinking about more than simply the democratic wishes of the Syrian people? Is there a hidden agenda? And who is likely to benefit from the fall of the Assad regime?
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking what people knew about events concerning Syria and why pressure on the Syrian regime has been increasing recently.
People are trying to get a bit more democracy and a bit more freedom going on, and it seems that the government are being pretty heavy-handed. That's what I've seen.
There has been a lot of unrest in Syria. However, I don't think that it's as similar to the situations in Bahrain and Libya and Egypt. It's a very different situation. There are many people in Syria, perhaps even the majority, I dare say, that are in favour of the current regime. They just want some reforms and so on. So I think that the fact that we often hear about Syria more than the others, like in Bahrain and Libya and Egypt, it shows the double standards of the Western media.
What has been going on in Syria in the last few months?
Well, I understand there's been a major clampdown on civil unrest, many deaths, some terrified people, yet to carry on demonstrating.
I think if you actually ask the Syrian people, because I know a lot of Syrians, they're actually with the president. They believe that it's time for reform. They are demanding reforms. However, they don't want a government change. And what we're seeing on TV is highly fabricated.
Not an awful lot. Same as everybody else. It's a closed nation. They don't tell anyone what's going on.
Why do you think there's now increasing pressure on President Assad?
Well, because the opposition forces seem to be getting support from other countries in the Middle East.
I wasn't aware that it had been.
I think because the President Assad, he is supporting the Palestinian people and he doesn't like to go and sign the agreement with a condition for the favor of Israel and to live with. Look like what happened in Egypt and Jordan.
Why has the pressure been building on Syria in the last few months in particular?
I think it's just because the movement itself is growing in strength, and the more people join the cause, then inevitably more international pressure will begin to show. So I think it's just a cause and effect, really.
Well, I mean, I think Assad's been kind of like a rogue person for the West for a while now. You know, I mean, I'm sure Assad wants to be in the good books of the West, but at the same time, he's essentially he's helping support Hezbollah and other organisations that the West don't like. So I think the West would be perfectly happy if they could get rid of him.
I think the reason is very simple. President Assad is very different to the other rulers of the other countries who are Western puppets.
Well, different views there from the people on the streets of London. Let's find out what our experts think.
Syria is also now the new front line for this confrontation. There is a desire to weaken Iranian hegemony in the Middle East from the West, and obviously Iran is seen as a major power. So you have a kind of new Sykes-Picot line in the Middle East that stretches from the south of Lebanon, going right across south of Syria, north of Jordan, south of Iraq, going straight down to the Gulf. Democracy is not a major issue for the Arab League, and certainly not for most of the states. The majority of the states of the Arab League are not democratic. Democracy is not a major issue for the West. The West has opposed democracy in the Middle East on many occasions, in Algeria, famously in Palestine, where after initial flirtation with democracy, it didn't like the outcome and therefore has been very uncomfortable with seeing another election in Palestine. We still haven't seen another election in Palestine. So democracy is not the issue, but it's a convenient flag to wave.
What started out in Syria was a reaction to the Arab Spring that was taking place in other Arab countries. And it started off as peaceful demonstrations, and as has happened in the other Arab countries where this has occurred, the repression was so violent that it has now taken on the protests have responded with violence as well. The people are watching their governments and seeing how they react to situations in neighboring countries. So that's the Arab League has been pressured to put pressure on Syria, whereas the EU, they've never been particularly warm towards that regime anyway.
The Arab League, as well as Western nations, say they're only interested in the democratic wishes of the Syrian people. Well, is that the whole truth, coming as it does from absolute monarchs from the Arabian Peninsula and Western nations who tut-tutted but otherwise looked away when pro-democracy protests were crushed in Bahrain and Yemen? Well, let's find out what the public thinks about that.
I think the politics with Bahrain and where Bahrain spends money with the Western countries maybe ensures that they're not looked at so carefully. Those regimes are let be at the moment.
Well, that's a very good question. It's probably to do with money, sadly.
The West has always been firm supporters of the Bahraini government, the Al Saud government, the Al Saud family, and so they don't want to change their perceptions. They don't want to see the good that Bashar is doing, and they don't want to see the bad that Hamad is doing.
The Arab League and Western governments say that they're only interested in the democratic wishes of the Syrian people. Do you think there's any more to it than that?
I'm not really sure. Everyone says that the Arab League is pretty powerless anyway. A dog without a bite, sort of thing. But I don't believe that totally, because I know that in Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries, they have very repressive regimes there. So I would say there's some other kind of agenda going on. We know that America supports Saudi Arabia, so perhaps there's some pressure from the United States for the Arab League to show disapproval of Syria. But otherwise, I don't really know the intrigues further than that.
I think, to be honest, we know that the dictatorship in Bahrain is a puppet government, and similar things can be said about Yemen, and even Egypt. Hosni Mubarak was a puppet of the Western governments. So, I mean, it's in the interests of the Western governments like Britain and USA to keep their dictators in power, but it's not in their interests to support the people when they're rising against their dictators. So anyone who opposes them, it's not in their interest to support such a person, even if they're supported by the people of that country.
There's a number of complicated factors. I think that part of it is the geopolitics of the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and generally the Gulf countries don't really want to be seen to be getting involved in that particularly, except for their sort of general support for Saudi Arabia and its interest in the Gulf.
There'll be some strange politics going on behind the scenes. The normal man in the street in Britain or wherever doesn't know. There'll be behind the scenes deals, so I don't think we can know why they're just concentrating on Syria and not other places.
The West intervened quite actively in the overthrow of Gaddafi. Why do you think they're not doing that in Libya? I mean, should they or not?
Well, I think that there's obviously something else going on. And I think, too, that some Western powers are very reluctant after what we've engaged in to go whole hog into anything. Hopefully we've learned some lessons, but hopefully that's the reason.
It's just an umbrella. They shade themselves. They would like to interfere in the nation affairs. Look like what happened in Bahrain or in Yemen or in Syria or in Libya.
Well, I think partly there's no appetite for another intervention. A lot of people, the Russians and Germans, they weren't happy about what the West did in Libya.
Possibly oil. It's why they toppled Libya, and Yemen and the others aren't as important. Can't get involved everywhere, I guess.
Obviously, the West intervened in Libya to help overthrow Gaddafi. Why do you think that a similar intervention is not taking place in Syria?
I think, well, it's a difficult question to answer. I think partly it is because of Israel. There is the Golan Heights issue, of course. That also plays a part.
I don't know whether there's a feeling with Syria that there's a head to the movement, or there's any one particular group or any coalition of peoples whereby the West could get in touch, and I may be out of date on that, but I think it's such a tinderbox of an area that if the West would start to overfly, and there's the Israeli question as well.
Obviously there's different interpretations and opinions about this, but Libya can be seen as similar to Iraq because they have oil resources, and it was a prime opportunity for the West to move its forces into Libya, so they took the opportunity. I think that's the main reason.
Iran, I would imagine Iran would come in with the Syrians, maybe. No one was going to help Libya, so they don't want another big war.
How much of the factor is it that arms are being sold to a lot of the Gulf states, to Saudi Arabia, and it's very big business? How much does that affect the politics of the Middle East?
I think it affects it hugely, and it's. I think it's part about gaining power in those territories. Again, it's geopolitical, and also exchange for oil and exchange for capital in those countries that has to get out.
There were rumours, I don't know if these are confirmed, but that Britain is selling arms to Bahrain. I know definitely that a lot of the tear gas canisters have signs saying made in Brazil, and America was also selling arms to Bahrain, and it just shows that they're supporting it.
I wouldn't know. Ask Adnan Khashoggi. I'm not an arms dealer.
As we know, the Saudi Arabia is the big seller for the weapons. They have a big deal, a big contract and guild deal with the US. It was for $68 billion to sell weapons, and that's the biggest deal during the history between a dealer and the exporter of the weapons.
Western nations sell a lot of arms to the Middle East. It's the biggest market. Do you think that might affect Western policy in the region?
Absolutely, yes. I know we do sell a lot of arms and weapons to the Middle East, and I would say that contracts and so forth would get in the way of the West barking too loudly against Syria. I think that just definitely would be part of the the issue, definitely, yeah.
I think it's very likely it has a considerable effect.
It should be. I mean, the US has got this $53 million arms deal with Bahrain on hold at the moment. And it looks very bad for the West to be selling arms to people who using them to put down their domestic uprisings. But I think it takes a situation like this to bring it to light, and because the West is happy to sell arms to people who use their arms to put down domestic insurgencies all the time. It's just that when those insurgencies get a lot more publicity, then it looks bad for the West. So I'm sure the West would like it to be business as usual, but hopefully public opinion won't let that happen.
I don't know. It's a murky world, arm trading. Where these countries get all of their weapons from, it's sometimes surprising to hear they come from all manner of sort of first world countries like Switzerland, UK, America. It seems with one hand we give them the tools, and the other hand we sit there and say that they shouldn't do such things. So, again, quite hypocritical.
Well, those are the views from the public. Let's now find out what our experts think.
Yes, the whole arms trade thing is hugely complex, like everything else, but I don't think it's the big dynamic, except in so much as the insurgents are now getting armed in Syria. And obviously there's Saudi money, there's other Qatari money, sometimes from private individuals as much as from governments, going to the insurgents so that they can purchase weapons. And the violence now is, up to a point, much more hands-on, genuine fighting. In Homs, I mean, the fighting in Homs has been quite dramatic. The Alawites, most of the Alawite community have fled to the coast up by Latakia. The Alawite shopping center was burnt down. A lot of Alawites killed. A lot of the minorities either standing to one side or standing with the government. Does this make for a civil war? No, the government is very strong. Its troops are very strong. But what you have is a grinding insurgency that is going to go on and on for years. I think 3-4 years at least until this thing is resolved. I don't see a fast end to this at all.
I don't think the Arab League is acting out of democracy, because most of the Arab League members are not democracies. They're simply trying to stop these respective governments having to deal with their own populations getting fed up with them. So that's really the reason why the Arab League is getting involved. There's not enough democracy in the Arab world for them to be saying, well, we're acting on behalf of democracy. I do believe that in terms of international pressure, there is democracy is part of the agenda in terms of putting pressure on Syria. But also, it's and this is often overlooked, especially with Western pressure on Syria, is that the government in Syria has always been belligerent towards the West. One can argue whether that's justified or not, but I think there is a sense among certain politicians and governments in the West that this is an opportunity to possibly see a more collaborative and pliant regime in Syria. If the Assad regime falls, then this could put in place a government that's more amenable to Western interests. For example, if you look at Libya now, the West was so instrumental in helping the rebels oust Gaddafi that it would be difficult to imagine that, for instance, France and Britain wouldn't benefit from the new situation in Libya.
So how likely is it that a full-blown civil war will break out in Syria? And if President Assad is overthrown, who will likely benefit from that?
There is already one. It's so far a war between army and the rest of but by the end of the day, there's no huge difference. It's a civil war. Once a different type of or different groups struggling for power.
I don't think it's so much a civil war, because most of the people, I'm not saying everyone, most of the people in Syria are happy with the president. However, they're asking for reforms, and the president is happy to listen to their demands, as he stated in a lot of his talks. And also there will be presidential elections in a few years' time. So I don't think there's a civil war in Syria, but it's kind of war in the media.
Well, there's an uprising, so what do you call that if you don't call it a civil war?
I mean, it's looking like it's going that way at the moment. You know, I'm sure that the Saudis and the West really want Assad gone. So, that you get all these reports about army deserters who are fighting the government army, and you generally think, well, are these just real deserters who are only supporting themselves, or are they getting funding or weapons from somewhere else? So who knows what's going on?
Do you think there will be civil war in Syria?
I really don't know. I feel like there's a little bit of it going on now.
No, because there kind of is at the moment. The best that the opposition can do, they are doing, and they're having no success. So I wouldn't see what would change that unless you get another country, getting involved.
Obviously, I hope there won't be, but with the West and Israel too applying, using everything possible to kind of initiate a civil war and to overthrow the government, it may be a possibility that materializes in the future, but I really hope there won't be.
If President Assad is toppled or is forced to leave somehow, who do you think the main beneficiaries will be?
I don't really know. It depends what follows him.
I think Israel and the USA and the UK governments will benefit very much.
Depends how he sets it up. If he's then well looked after with the people from below him who take over and meet the new boss same as the old boss, it depends. Hopefully the people, but I would never bet on it.
I guess the Saudis would be the beneficiary.
I would hope that there would be more democracy and more freedom for the people of Syria, as we've seen in other countries in the Middle East in recent weeks and months. However, you never know what's going to be the alternative. And this is often the problem. When a country becomes destabilised, the people that take over can be even worse. So I don't know what will happen. Any of the above.
Who do you think would benefit if President Assad was overthrown?
Hopefully the nation will benefit. I don't know what is the Western stake in it. I really don't know.
I think the West would definitely benefit, and because obviously, as I stated about Hezbollah, they don't want a strong Hezbollah because that imposes a big threat onto them.
The people as a whole. There has to be a whole regime change.
Well, I suppose you would like to think that people would get a vote, people would get a say, but inevitably history teaches us way back from the Russians that usually when these revolutions, the position of the people in the street gets worse. Just as we've seen in Egypt, people are now rioting again, coming to the streets again because they thought things would be better. It hasn't actually filtered down to the man in the street. Structures are lost, people are not eating, services aren't delivered. So certainly for a significant period of time, things usually don't get better.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks so much for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.